Title: Whispers from Above. True Stories of Angels in Everyday Life. Volume 1. The Guardians of the Road. To understand the nature of miracles, one must first respect the terrifying physics of the highway. We walk through this life believing we are alone, trusting in friction, in gravity, and in the mechanical reliability of steel and rubber. We believe that if we hold the steering wheel tight enough, we control our destiny. But ask any paramedic or any tow truck driver who has pulled a pristine survivor out of a mangle of crushed metal, and they will tell you that sometimes the math doesn't add up. Sometimes, the car stops when it shouldn't. Sometimes, a hand grabs the wheel when no one else is in the car. The road is the great connector of human lives, but it is also a place of solitude and danger, where the veil between this world and the next is often at its thinnest. Our first account takes us to the frozen expanse of Interstate 90 in South Dakota during the winter of 1998. Mark, a 24-year-old graduate student, was attempting to drive home for Christmas in a beat-up 1988 Honda Civic. The forecast had called for light flurries, but by the time he hit the middle of the state, the world had turned into a white void. Mark's car had bad tires and no anti-lock brakes. He was gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles were white, navigating solely by the sound of the rumble strips on the shoulder because the lane markers had vanished under inches of packed snow. Suddenly, the rear of the car snapped to the right. He had hit black ice. Instinctively, he did what you are never supposed to do. He slammed on the brakes. The car entered a violent, uncontrolled spin. Mark remembers seeing the guardrail rushing toward his face, and he knew what lay beyond it, a steep drop-off into a frozen ravine. He closed his eyes and screamed, bracing for the impact that would end his life. But the crunch of metal never came. Instead of a crash, Mark felt a sensation of immense weight, not upon him, but against the car itself. He described it later as if the vehicle had driven into a giant pile of feathers. The spinning stopped instantly. The car didn't slide, it didn't skid. It simply stopped, defying all momentum, facing the wrong way on the highway. Mark sat there hyperventilating in the dead silence. He looked out his window and saw that his bumper was inches, mere inches, from the edge of the ravine. Then, there was a knock on his window. Mark jumped. He hadn't seen any headlights. He hadn't heard an engine approaching. Standing in the blizzard was a man who looked to be in his 50s, wearing a red flannel jacket and a trucker hat. He didn't look cold, despite the sub-zero wind howling across the plains. Mark rolled down the window, trembling. The stranger spoke in a soft, calm voice that seemed to cut through the noise of the storm. "You're okay, son," he said. "Put it in neutral. I'll get you turned around." Mark was confused. His car had stalled, and the ice was like a sheet of glass. It should have been impossible for one man to push a car, especially without slipping. But Mark put the car in neutral. The stranger placed one hand, just one gloved hand, on the hood of the car. Mark swears to this day that the car rotated as if it weighed nothing, spinning 180 degrees smoothly on the ice as if it were on a turntable. The man didn't grunt or strain. Once the car was facing the right direction, the stranger walked back to the window. "Stay in the right lane," he instructed. "The plow is 2 miles up. Follow him. You'll be home for dinner." Mark looked down for a split second to put the car in gear, and when he looked up to say thank you, the road was empty. There were no other tire tracks in the snow. No truck parked nearby. No footprints leading away into the dark. Mark drove 2 miles up, found the snowplow exactly as predicted, and made it home alive. Skeptics call it adrenaline, or the brain trying to make sense of trauma. But the recurring details in these stories are hard to ignore. The sudden stillness, the silence, and frequently, the physical sensation of a giant hand. Our next story involves a similar intervention, but this time on a night bus traveling from London to Glasgow in 2011. Sarah, a university student, was sitting near the front of the red-eye bus, right behind the driver. It was 3 a.m., raining heavily, and the bus was navigating a winding section of the motorway known for accidents. Sarah couldn't sleep. She had an overwhelming knot of dread in her stomach. She watched the driver in the large rearview mirror. His eyes were drooping. His head bobbed. He was fighting exhaustion, and he was losing. Sarah wanted to shout, but her voice was frozen in her throat. She saw the heavy bus drifting toward the concrete median at 60 miles per hour. That was when she saw him. Sarah hadn't seen anyone board the bus at the last stop, but suddenly, a tall man in a gray trench coat was standing in the aisle, right next to the driver's cabin. He didn't look at Sarah. He looked strictly at the driver. He reached out and firmly tapped the driver on the shoulder 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. The driver jolted awake with a gasp. He yanked the wheel to the left, correcting the bus just as the tires began to screech against the gravel of the median. The bus stabilized, swerving back into the lane safely. The driver looked around wildly, shouting, "Who touched me? Who's standing there?" Sarah stood up and looked at the aisle. It was empty. The few other passengers in the back were fast asleep. She walked up to the driver's partition, her legs shaking. "I saw him," she whispered. "A man in a gray coat. He woke you up." The driver's face went pale. He gripped the wheel tightly and whispered back, "My father died 5 years ago. He was buried in his gray trench coat. He used to tap me on the shoulder just like that to wake me up for school." Sometimes the intervention is violent, a necessary force to counter the laws of physics. John, a retired police officer from North Carolina, was a man of logic and evidence. He didn't believe in ghosts until the afternoon of October 14, 2005. He was riding his motorcycle along the Blue Ridge Parkway, a beautiful but unforgiving road. He admits he was going too fast when he came around a blind corner and saw a massive delivery truck that had crossed the center line. It was taking up John's entire lane. There was no shoulder, only a sheer rock face to his right and the grill of the truck to his left. Physics dictated that John was about to die. John says time didn't slow down. It stopped. The noise of the engine vanished. In that split second, he felt a physical sensation of 2 giant hands grabbing the handlebars of his bike over his own hands. The bike was yanked violently to the right, defying momentum. It leaned over so far that the pegs scraped the asphalt, sending sparks flying, and threaded through a gap no wider than 3 feet between the truck and the mountain wall. He came out the other side, wobbling, and came to a stop. The truck driver, who had also stopped, came running back, sobbing, screaming that he had killed the rider. When he saw John standing there, the driver fell to his knees. John looked at his bike. On the rubber grips of the handlebars, there was a strange residue, a gold dust that felt warm to the touch. John never sped on that road again. He retired from the force a year later, telling his story not as a boast of skill, but as a confession of surrender. Volume 2. The Stranger in the Room. If the highway is a place of kinetic danger, the hospital is a place of quiet waiting. It is a liminal space, a threshold between this world and the next, smelling of antiseptic and anxiety. It is here, in the fluorescent-lit corridors of the night shift, that the veil is frequently pierced. Nurses and doctors are often the reluctant witnesses to these events, seeing things that medical science cannot explain. The visitors who check in but never leave, the comforting figures who sit by the beds of the dying, and the impossible recoveries that defy the charts. In 1994, at a large county hospital in Ohio, a young nurse named Brenda was working the graveyard shift in the pediatric ICU. It was a stormy night, and the unit was tense. In room 4, a 6-year-old boy named Leo was battling severe pneumonia. His fever was spiking dangerously high, and his breathing was labored. Brenda had checked on him at 2 a.m., administering medication and trying to cool him down, but his vitals were deteriorating. She went to the nurse's station to page the doctor, her heart heavy with the fear that Leo wouldn't make it through the night. When she returned to the hallway 10 minutes later, she saw a soft light spilling out from under Leo's door. Brenda hurried to the room, assuming the boy had woken up or that a machine was malfunctioning. When she pushed the door open, she stopped dead in her tracks. Sitting in the chair by Leo's bed was a woman. She was dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, a starch white dress and a cap, the kind not worn since the 1950s. She was humming a melody that Brenda couldn't recognize, stroking Leo's forehead with a cool, damp cloth. The woman looked up at Brenda and smiled. It was a smile of infinite peace. "He's breaking the fever," the woman said softly. "Go rest, Brenda. I have the watch." Brenda was stunned. She blinked, confused by the strange uniform and the fact that she hadn't seen anyone sign in. She turned around for a split second to check the hallway for security, and when she looked back into the room, the chair was empty. The woman was gone. But Leo was sleeping peacefully. His breathing had smoothed out, and his skin, previously burning hot, was cool to the touch. When Brenda checked the monitors, his fever had broken completely. The next morning, Brenda described the woman to the older charge nurse. The charge nurse went pale and pulled an old black and white photo from a file cabinet. "That's Mary," she said. "She was the head nurse here 40 years ago. She died in this wing. They say she still comes back when the children are in trouble." Sometimes, the visitor isn't a ghost of the past, but a stranger who brings a message of specific, impossible knowledge. In 2008, a man named David was pacing the waiting room of a hospital in Chicago. His wife was in emergency surgery after a catastrophic car accident. The doctors had told him to prepare for the worst. The internal bleeding was extensive. David was a broken man, weeping into his hands, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. The waiting room was empty at 4 a.m., except for David. Or so he thought. He felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up to see a young man in a janitor's uniform standing there. The man had piercing blue eyes and a name tag that simply read, Gabriel. He sat down next to David, not saying a word at first, just offering a presence of solid, grounding calm. David found himself pouring his heart out to this stranger, telling him about his wife, their kids, and the fear that was consuming him. The janitor listened intently, then stood up. He placed a hand on David's forehead. "The bleeding has stopped," he said clearly. "The artery they couldn't find? The surgeon just found it. She is going to be fine, David. Go get some coffee." Before David could ask how a janitor would know about the surgery, the man walked around the corner toward the elevators. Minutes later, the surgeon burst into the waiting room, looking exhausted but relieved. "It's a miracle," the doctor said, pulling off his surgical cap. "We were losing her. We couldn't locate the source of the bleed. And then, suddenly, it was just there. We clamped it. She stabilized instantly." David asked the doctor if he knew a janitor named Gabriel. The doctor shook his head. "We use a contract service for cleaning," he said. "They don't have anyone by that name on the night shift." David ran to the elevators, but the hallway was empty. His wife made a full recovery, but David never saw the man with the blue eyes again. There are also moments where the intervention is viewed not by the family, but by the skeptical medical professionals themselves. Dr. Aris, an emergency room physician with 20 years of experience, tells the story of a code blue that changed his view of reality. A patient, a man in his 40s, had gone into cardiac arrest. The team worked on him for 45 minutes. They had shocked him 6 times, pushed epinephrine, and done everything by the book. There was no rhythm. Dr. Aris was about to call the time of death. He looked at the clock on the wall, defeated. As he took a breath to speak the final words, Dr. Aris saw something in the corner of the trauma room. He describes it not as a person, but as a column of heat, a shimmering distortion in the air, like heat rising off asphalt in the summer. From this distortion, he felt a wave of immense authority, a silent command that said, "Try one more time." It went against all medical logic. The heart muscle was dead. But compelled by the feeling, Dr. Aris ordered, "Charge the paddles again. Clear." The nurses looked at him like he was crazy, but they obeyed. They delivered the shock. Instantly, the monitor beeped. A perfect, strong sinus rhythm appeared on the screen. The patient gasped, his eyes flying open. The distortion in the corner vanished. The patient later told Dr. Aris that he had been floating above the room, watching the doctor's work, when a being of light grabbed his hand and shoved him back into his body, telling him that his contract wasn't up yet. Dr. Aris wrote "spontaneous return of circulation" on the chart, but in his personal journal, he wrote a different word, "miracle." Volume 3, The Warning Voice. There is a distinct difference between the quiet nudge of intuition and the shock of an audible command. Most of us are familiar with the gut feeling, that internal sense of unease that suggests we should take an umbrella or call an old friend. But there is another phenomenon, far rarer and more startling, reported by people all over the world. The experience of hearing a voice that is distinctly external, authoritative, and urgent. It is not a thought inside the head. It is a sound that strikes the eardrum, a voice that often speaks with a volume and clarity that demands instant obedience. These are the auditory interventions, the warnings shouted from thin air that split the difference between life and death in a fraction of a second. Consider the terrifying experience of Thomas, a veteran coal miner in West Virginia in the late 1960s. Coal mining is a profession of darkness and claustrophobia, where men learn to listen to the mountain. They know the groan of the earth and the creak of timber supports. But on a Tuesday in November, the mine was silent. Thomas was working a seam deep in the B shaft, alone in a narrow tunnel, loading debris into a cart. He was a pragmatic man, not given to flights of fancy. He was whistling a tune, focused on his work, when the silence was shattered. Right next to his right ear, loud enough to make him jump, a male voice shouted, "Run!" Thomas froze. He spun around, swinging his headlamp, expecting to see the foreman or a fellow miner playing a prank. The tunnel was empty. The dust motes danced in the beam of his light. He stood there for a heartbeat, confused, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then, the voice came again, this time screaming with a desperate, guttural intensity. "Run! Now!" The fear in the voice was contagious. Thomas didn't think. He dropped his shovel and sprinted back toward the main junction, his boots slamming against the slate floor. He made it 40 yards before the world behind him imploded. The ceiling of the tunnel where he had been standing collapsed in a catastrophic failure of the rock strata. Thousands of tons of rock filled the space instantly. Had he hesitated for 5 seconds to look for the source of the voice, he would have been flattened. Thomas later told his crew that the voice didn't sound like anyone he knew. It sounded like a military commander giving an order in the heat of battle. Sometimes the voice does not command action, but cessation. In 1989, a woman named Elena was driving her 2 daughters to school in the suburbs of Seattle. It was a routine morning, the radio playing, the girls arguing over a toy in the back seat. Elena was approaching a large intersection where she had the green light. She was traveling at 45 miles per hour, and she could see clearly that the intersection was empty. Her foot remained steady on the gas pedal. As she approached the line, a voice, calm, stern, and female, spoke from the passenger seat. "Stop." Elena looked at the passenger seat. It was piled with backpacks and lunchboxes. There was no one there. She shook her head, assuming she was hearing things, and kept driving. The voice spoke again, louder this time, vibrating with authority. "Elena, stop." The use of her name shocked her into a physical reaction. She slammed on the brakes in the middle of the road, screeching to a halt 10 feet before the intersection. Her daughters screamed in surprise. The car behind her honked aggressively. For a second, Elena felt foolish, stopped at a green light for no reason. Then, a massive cement truck, whose brakes had failed on the cross-street hill, barreled through the red light at 60 miles per hour. It tore through the exact space Elena's car would have occupied had she not stopped. The wind from the truck shook her vehicle. Elena sat trembling at the green light, listening to the terrified silence of her children, knowing that a disembodied command was the only reason they were not metal and glass scattered across the asphalt. The warning voice is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is a whisper in the night that prevents a slow-moving tragedy. In 2012, a new mother named Sarah was sleeping deeply, exhausted from weeks of colicky nights with her infant son. The baby monitor was on, but the baby was finally asleep. The house was quiet. At 3 a.m., Sarah woke up suddenly. She hadn't heard a cry. She hadn't heard a noise. She had heard a whisper, right against her pillow, saying, "Check the heat." Groggy and confused, Sarah tried to go back to sleep. She told herself it was a dream. She pulled the duvet up. But the whisper came again, persistent and irritatingly clear. "Check the heat." Sarah got out of bed, annoyed, thinking perhaps she had left the thermostat too high. She walked into the hallway and immediately smelled something faint, like burning plastic. She followed the smell to the nursery. The baby was sleeping, but the smell was stronger there. She looked at the electric space heater in the corner of the room. The cord, which was tucked behind the dresser, had frayed and was sparking silently against the carpet. A small circle of smoldering fire had already started, glowing orange in the dark, inches from the curtains. Sarah grabbed the baby and unplugged the heater, stomping out the smoldering carpet. 5 more minutes, and the curtains would have caught, turning the nursery into an inferno. The voice hadn't screamed, it had simply nudged her, a vigilant sentry watching while the mother slept. Volume 4. The Vanishing Rescuer. If the disembodied voice is difficult for the skeptical mind to accept, the phenomenon of the vanishing rescuer is even harder. These are the stories where the angelic intervention takes on physical mass. These entities do not just speak. They lift, they pull, they fight, and they interact with the physical world. They appear in the guise of humans, often unremarkable strangers, who possess strength or timing that defies explanation, only to disappear the moment the danger has passed. They are the solid angels, the ones who leave fingerprints for a moment and then vanish into the ether. The ocean is a vast, indifferent killer, and riptides are its silent traps. In the summer of 2003, a teenager named Chris was swimming off the coast of Florida. He was a strong swimmer, but he underestimated the current. He found himself pulled out to sea, caught in a rip that dragged him under every time he tried to surface. He fought for minutes, swallowing salt water, his muscles burning with lactic acid. Panic set in. He realized he was drowning. He went under for what he thought was the last time, seeing the sun filtering through the water above him, drifting further away. Suddenly, a strong arm hooked around his chest. It wasn't the desperate grab of another swimmer, it was a grip of iron. Chris was hauled to the surface with incredible speed. He gasped for air, coughing, and looked at his rescuer. It was a man, tanned, with blonde hair, wearing strange, old-fashioned swim trunks. The man didn't say a word. He put Chris in a lifeguard carry and swam against the riptide as if it were a calm pool. He cut through the water with impossible power. When they reached the shallows, the man dragged Chris onto the sand and set him down gently. Chris rolled over, vomiting water, wiping the salt from his eyes. He took a moment to catch his breath, then looked up to thank the man. The beach was crowded, but the man was gone. Chris ran to the lifeguard tower. The lifeguard on duty, who had been watching the water with binoculars, looked confused. "I saw you struggling," the lifeguard said. "I was about to blow the whistle. And then, you just sort of body surfed in. I didn't see anyone with you." Chris had been carried by a ghost. These vanishing rescuers also appear in the concrete jungles of our cities, often intervening in moments of human violence. A woman named Rebecca tells a harrowing story from her time living in New York City in the late 1990s. She was walking home late from a shift at a restaurant, taking a shortcut through an alleyway she usually avoided. Halfway through, she realized she was being followed. She walked faster. The footsteps behind her sped up. She turned to see two men, clearly aggressive, closing the distance. One pulled a knife. Rebecca backed up against a dumpster, trapped, preparing to scream, though she knew the street was deserted. From the shadows of the alley, a dead end that she knew was empty, a massive figure stepped out. Rebecca describes him as a giant, a man standing nearly 7 feet tall, wearing a long, dark coat. He didn't look at Rebecca. He stepped between her and the attackers. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, emanating a wave of terrifying, raw power. The two attackers froze. They looked at the giant, then at each other, their faces draining of color. They dropped the knife and ran, sprinting out of the alley as if the devil himself were chasing them. Rebecca turned to the giant to thank him, to ask who he was. But there was no one there. The alley was a cul-de-sac. There was no door he could have entered, no fire escape he could have climbed in 2 seconds. The space where he had stood was empty, save for a sudden, swirling wind that smelled of ozone and rain. Perhaps the most baffling category of vanishing rescuers involves mechanical assistants. We assume angels deal in souls, not carburetors, but the archives of the unexplained suggest otherwise. In 1974, a family was driving an old station wagon across the Nevada desert. It was August, 110 degrees in the shade, and they were miles from civilization. The car overheated and died. Steam billowed from the engine. The father, a mechanic himself, opened the hood and realized the radiator hose had burst completely. They had no water, no spare hose, and no cell phones existed. They were stranded in lethal heat. After an hour of waiting, a pristine, vintage pickup truck pulled over. It looked like a truck from the 1940s, but it looked brand new. No dust, no scratches. An old man in denim overalls stepped out. He didn't ask what was wrong. He walked straight to the hood. He carried a toolbox that looked like it was made of solid wood. "Just a hose," he muttered. He reached into his toolbox and pulled out a radiator hose that looked exactly the right size. He didn't use a screwdriver. He seemed to tighten the clamps with his bare fingers. He poured a jug of clear water into the radiator. "Try it now," he said. The father turned the key. The car started perfectly. The temperature gauge dropped to normal. The father got out to offer the man money, to thank him for saving their lives. He walked around the front of the car to where the man had been standing. The road was empty. The desert stretched flat for 10 miles in every direction. There was no truck, no dust cloud from a departing vehicle, just the heat waves shimmering off the asphalt. The father looked at the engine. The new radiator hose was there, but it wasn't made of rubber. It was made of a strange blue silicone material that wouldn't be invented for another 20 years. The family drove the rest of the way in silence, carried by a part that shouldn't exist, installed by a mechanic who wasn't there. Volume 5. Comfort in the cold. Grief is not a fire. It is a freezing. It is a physical drop in temperature that settles in the bones when we lose someone we love. It is a fog that dulls the senses, making the world feel distant and gray. In these moments of profound isolation, when the silence of a house becomes deafening, the veil between the living and the spiritual often becomes porous. The angels that appear in these moments are not warriors or rescuers of the flesh, they are guardians of the heart. They arrive not to save the body from danger, but to save the mind from despair, offering a moment of warmth in the absolute zero of loss. In the winter of 2010, a woman named Margaret was burying her husband of 50 years, Arthur. It was a small, bleak service in a rural cemetery in Maine. The wind was biting, and the ground was hard as iron. Margaret and Arthur had no children, and most of their friends had already passed. There were only 4 people at the graveside: Margaret, the priest, and 2 distant cousins. Margaret felt a crushing loneliness, a terrifying realization that she was now completely alone in the world. As the priest spoke the final commendation, Margaret looked up and saw a man standing at the edge of the cemetery, near the tree-line. He was dressed in a suit that looked out of date, a charcoal wool cut from the 1940s, and he held a fedora in his hands. He was tall, with a kind, weathered face. He didn't approach the grave, he just stood vigil, watching Margaret with an expression of intense compassion. Margaret assumed he was an old friend of Arthur's from the VFW who had heard the news. After the service, as the cousins walked to their cars, the man approached Margaret. He didn't offer a handshake. He simply looked her in the eyes and said, "Arthur is safe. He wanted you to know that the pain in his chest is gone, and he's waiting by the river." Margaret gasped. Arthur had died of a sudden, agonizing heart attack. The pain in his chest. But the reference to the river shattered her composure. The river was a private code between them, a reference to a picnic spot where they had gotten engaged in 1955, a place no one else knew about. Margaret looked down to grab a tissue from her purse to wipe her eyes. It took her 3 seconds. When she looked up, the man was gone. The cemetery was surrounded by open fields of snow. There were no footprints leading away from where he had stood. The snow was pristine. Margaret drove home that day not with the heavy heart of a widow, but with the peace of a woman who had received a message delivered by a courier who walked above the snow. Sometimes, the comfort comes in the form of a physical presence that defies the emptiness of a room. In 1999, a young mother named Clara lost her 4-year-old daughter to leukemia. The grief was so visceral that Clara stopped eating. She spent her days lying on her daughter's bed, smelling the pillow, slipping into a deep depression. One afternoon, the pain was so acute she prayed for death. She was curled in a fetal position, sobbing, her back to the door. Suddenly, the mattress dipped. Clara froze. She felt the distinct, unmistakable weight of a person sitting on the edge of the bed. Then, she felt a hand, warm, solid, and large, rest on her shoulder. It wasn't the small hand of a child, it was the hand of an adult. A wave of heat traveled from the hand into Clara's body, a physical sensation of love that felt like liquid gold. A voice, genderless and melodic, whispered in her ear, "She is playing. She is laughing. You must eat." The weight stayed on the bed for 10 minutes, stroking her hair until Clara stopped crying. When she finally gathered the courage to turn around, the room was empty. but the indentation on the mattress remained for another hour, slowly rising back to flat. Clara got up, went to the kitchen, and made a sandwich. It was the first meal she had eaten in a week. The visitor hadn't brought her daughter back, but they had brought Clara back to the land of the living. There are also instances where the comfort is auditory, a shared experience among a group of mourners. At a funeral in New Orleans for a beloved jazz musician in 2005, the mood was somber. The church was packed. The choir began to sing Amazing Grace, but the sound system failed. The microphone cut out. The choir, disheartened, sang quietly. Then, from the rafters of the old church, an area that was empty and locked, a voice joined in. It was a tenor voice of impossible purity and power. It didn't sound like it was coming from a speaker. It sounded like it was coming from the air itself. The voice harmonized with the choir, filling the cathedral, vibrating the stained glass. The congregation looked up. The choir director stopped conducting, looking confused but awed. The voice held the final high note for a duration that no human lungs could sustain, fading into a shimmering silence. There was no applause, only a holy hush. Later, the priest checked the loft. It was dusty and undisturbed. There were no hidden speakers. The congregation left the funeral not talking about the tragedy of the death, but about the singer in the ceiling who had turned a funeral into a glimpse of the celestial choir. Volume 6. The Impossible Cushion. Gravity is the most strictly enforced law on Earth. It does not bargain, and it does not forgive. When a human body falls from a significant height, or is thrown from a moving vehicle, the result is calculated by mass, velocity, and the hardness of the impact surface. Trauma surgeons call it the deceleration injury, the moment the internal organs collide with the skeleton. But there is a file in the archives of emergency medicine labeled Miraculous Survival, containing cases where the physics of the fall demanded death, but the patient walked away with bruises. Survivors often report the same sensation, the feeling of being caught, suspended, or wrapped in a substance that absorbed the blow. The story of the fourth-floor baby is legendary among the EMTs of Paris, France. In 1987, a toddler managed to climb onto a balcony railing while his mother was in the kitchen. A pedestrian on the street below looked up in horror to see the child lose his balance and tumble over the edge. It was a 40-foot drop onto solid concrete pavement. The pedestrian, a man named Henri, screamed but was too far away to catch the boy. He watched the child fall, bracing for the sickening sound of impact. But halfway down, Henri saw the air around the child shimmer. It looked, he said, like a bubble of heat distortion. The child's fall slowed down perceptibly, not stopping, but breaking, as if falling through thick syrup. When the boy hit the concrete, he didn't bounce. He landed softly on his bottom, looking surprised but unharmed. He stood up and started crying, not from pain, but from fear. The mother rushed down, hysterical, expecting to find a broken body. The paramedics arrived and couldn't find a scratch on him. No broken bones. No internal bleeding. The physics suggested an impact of 30 miles per hour. The reality was a gentle plop. Henri gave a statement to the police, describing the air cushion he had witnessed. The police wrote it down as a freak updraft, but Henri knew better. He had seen the air curve around the boy like a pair of cupped hands. Sometimes the cushion appears in the violent chaos of a car wreck. In 2011, a storm chaser named Kyle was tracking a tornado in Oklahoma. His SUV was heavy, reinforced for weather, but it was no match for the EF4 twister that suddenly changed direction. The funnel cloud picked up Kyle's vehicle and threw it 300 yards into a field. The car rolled dozens of times, crushing the roof flat against the doors. When the first responders arrived, they saw a pancake of twisted metal. They called for the jaws of life to extract the body, assuming it was a recovery mission, not a rescue. As they began to cut the door, they heard a voice from inside. "I'm okay," Kyle yelled. "I'm just stuck." The firefighters peeled back the roof. Inside the crushed cabin, the driver's seat was encased in a perfect, spherical void. The metal roof, which was crushed flat everywhere else, had bent around Kyle's head and shoulders in a dome shape that defied the structural stress lines of the steel. It was as if a force field had expanded around his body, forcing the collapsing metal outward. Kyle crawled out without a single fracture. He told the firefighters that as the car was rolling, he felt a pressure pressing against his chest and head, holding him pinned to the seat while the metal screamed around him. He described it as being hugged by a giant. The firefighters looked at the dome in the metal. There was no roll bar, no reinforcement beam that could explain it. The steel had simply refused to crush the man. Perhaps the most dramatic examples occur in the wilderness, where hikers face the unforgiving geometry of cliffs. A climber named Sarah was scaling a route in Yosemite in the late 90s. She was free soloing a short section, climbing without a rope, when a foothold crumbled. She fell backward, tumbling toward a ledge 60 feet below. A fall of that distance onto granite is almost always fatal. Sarah remembers the wind rushing past her ears, the terror of the drop, and then a sensation of being swatted. She didn't hit the ledge directly. Instead, she felt a massive, unseen force shove her mid-air, altering her trajectory sideways. She crashed into a thick pine tree that was growing out of the cliff face, a tree that was 10 feet to the left of her fall line. The branches broke her fall, and she tumbled onto a bed of soft pine needles, winding up with a broken ankle and a lot of scratches. SAR, search and rescue teams were baffled. Based on where she fell, gravity should have pulled her straight down onto the rocks. To hit the tree, she would have had to jump sideways in mid-air. Sarah insists she didn't jump. "I was pushed," she says. "Someone slapped me out of the air like a volleyball, right into the only soft spot on the mountain." These stories of the impossible cushion force us to reconsider the rigidity of the physical world. We are taught that hard surfaces are unforgiving, but these accounts suggest that matter itself can become malleable when a higher protection is invoked. The concrete softens, the steel bends, and the trajectory shifts, leaving scientists scratching their heads and survivors whispering prayers of thanks to the invisible hands that caught them. Volume 7. Children of the Light. There is a widely held belief in spiritual circles that the very young and the very old exist closest to the veil, that thin, shimmering boundary that separates our physical reality from the spiritual realm. While the elderly are preparing to cross over, children have just arrived. Their perception has not yet been calcified by logic, skepticism, or the rigid rules of the material world. They see with fresh eyes, and often, they see things that adults have learned to ignore. Parents frequently dismiss these interactions as imaginary friends or overactive imaginations, but the specificity and consistency of these encounters often suggests something far more profound, that children are the natural mediums of the angelic world. In 2014, a family in rural Vermont moved into a farmhouse that had been in their lineage for generations. The couple had a 3-year-old daughter named Lily. Shortly after the move, Lily began having animated conversations in her bedroom when she was supposed to be napping. Her mother, assuming Lily was playing with dolls, listened in on the baby monitor. She heard Lily giggling and asking questions, leaving pauses for answers she couldn't hear. One afternoon, the mother walked in to find Lily sitting in the middle of the floor, offering a tea cup to empty air. When asked who she was talking to, Lily pointed to the rocking chair in the corner and said, "The funny man." The mother, slightly unnerved, asked what the funny man looked like. Lily described him with chilling precision. He had white hair like cotton, he wore suspenders with ducks on them, and he smelled like sweet smoke. The mother froze. She ran to the attic and dug out a photo album. She showed Lily a picture of her own grandfather, Lily's great-grandfather, who had died 10 years before Lily was born. He was a man known for his eccentric duck suspenders and his pipe tobacco. "That's him," Lily shouted. "That's the funny man." The most shocking detail came a week later. Lily ran downstairs holding a shiny 1945 silver dollar. "The funny man pulled it out of my ear," she squealed. The mother knew for a fact there were no silver dollars in the house. They had all been sold after the grandfather's death. Yet here was a mint-condition coin, a signature magic trick of a man long gone, gifted to a child he had never met in life. Sometimes, the entity a child sees is not a relative, but a protector who appears during moments of distinct peril. In 1998, a 4-year-old boy named Sam was playing in the front yard of his home in suburban Chicago. His mother was gardening nearby, her back turned for just a moment. The street was on a steep hill, and a teenager in a sedan had forgotten to set his parking brake. The car began to roll backward down the hill, gaining speed, silent and deadly, heading straight for the curb where Sam was playing with his trucks. The mother heard the neighbors screaming. She turned around just in time to see the car jump the curb, heading directly for her son. She was too far away to reach him. She screamed his name, watching helplessly. But Sam didn't run. He stood up and stared at the space directly in front of him, his eyes wide. Suddenly, he was shoved backward violently, landing in the soft grass 4 feet away. The car smashed into the exact spot where he had been standing, crushing his toy truck into the dirt. When the mother reached him, sobbing and checking for injuries, Sam was calm. "Why did you push me?" the mother asked, assuming he had tripped. "I didn't," Sam said. "The big angel pushed me. He has wings made of fire." Sam pointed to the crushed truck. "He said the car was bad." The mother looked at the empty yard. There was no one there. But on Sam's shirt, right in the center of his chest, was a handprint made of dirt, a handprint that was twice the size of a human hand. The interactions are not always dramatic. Sometimes they are simply moments of unexplained comfort during the terrors of the night. A father named Mark tells the story of his daughter, Sophie, who suffered from terrible night terrors. Every night at 2 a.m., she would wake up screaming, inconsolable, pointing at shadows in the corner. Mark and his wife tried everything: night lights, therapy, leaving the door open. Nothing worked. The family was exhausted. Then, one night, the screaming stopped. Mark woke up at 3 a.m., realizing the house was silent. He walked to Sophie's room to check on her. He pushed the door open quietly. Sophie was sitting up in bed, looking into the corner where she usually saw monsters. But she wasn't crying. She was smiling. She was waving her hand gently, as if saying goodbye. Mark whispered, "Sophie? Are you okay?" She turned to him, her face glowing in the moonlight. "The lady is nice, Daddy," she whispered. "She sings songs that make the monsters sleep." Mark looked at the corner. It was empty, but the room felt different. The air was warm, and it smelled faintly of roses. Sophie never had a night terror again. When asked to draw the lady, Sophie drew a figure made entirely of yellow crayon strokes, radiating light like the sun. "She doesn't have feet," Sophie explained. "She floats." Volume 8. Dreams of Deliverance. While children see with open eyes, adults often receive their messages when their eyes are closed. Sleep is a state of vulnerability, but it is also a state of receptivity. When the conscious mind is powered down, when the logic, the skepticism, and the noise of the daily grind are silenced, the subconscious becomes a receiver for signals that transcend time and space. Throughout history, from biblical prophets to modern CEOs, people have reported dreams that offered specific, actionable warnings about dangers they could not possibly know about. These are not the chaotic, symbolic dreams of Freud. These are the dreams of deliverance, clear, vivid, and urgent nightmares that demand to be acted upon. In the summer of 2001, a flight attendant named Angela was scheduled to work a routine flight from Boston to Los Angeles. Angela loved her job and was never anxious about flying. But 3 nights before the trip, she had a dream. It wasn't a normal dream, it was hyper-realistic. She dreamt she was standing in the galley of the plane, preparing coffee. Suddenly, the cabin filled with smoke. She felt the plane pitch violently downward. She heard the specific sound of screaming, and then, a voice, a calm, male voice, spoke directly into her ear. "Do not board the Tuesday flight. Call in sick." Angela woke up in a cold sweat, her heart racing. She dismissed it as stress. But the next night, the dream recurred, exactly the same. The smoke, the scream, and the voice. "Do not board the Tuesday flight." By the 3rd night, the dread was so physical she was vomiting. On Tuesday morning, she called her supervisor, her hands shaking, and lied, claiming she had severe food poisoning. She sat on her couch, guilt-ridden for missing work. Later that day, she turned on the news. The date was September 11th. Her flight was United 175, the second plane to hit the World Trade Center. Angela collapsed to the floor. The voice in her dream hadn't just saved her from a crash, it had plucked her from the center of a historical tragedy. She never flew again, dedicating her life to hospice care, feeling she owed a debt for the life she was allowed to keep. Dreams of deliverance can also be domestic, protecting families from silent killers in their own homes. In 1995, a father named Robert was sleeping soundly in his suburban home in Michigan. It was winter, and the furnace was running hard. At 4 a.m., Robert entered a lucid dream state. In the dream, he was walking through his own house. Everything looked normal, but there was a red haze hanging in the air. He walked to the basement door in the dream, and standing there was his grandmother, who had passed away 5 years prior. She looked frantic. She was pointing at the basement door and screaming, but no sound was coming out. She slammed her hand against the door, pointing down, mouthing the word, "poison." Robert woke up gasping, sitting bolt upright. The house was quiet. His wife was asleep beside him. He felt silly, but the image of his grandmother was so vivid he couldn't shake it. He got out of bed and walked to the basement door. He opened it and was immediately hit with a wave of dizziness and nausea. He stumbled back, recognizing the symptoms instantly: carbon monoxide. He ran upstairs, woke his wife and 3 children, and dragged them out into the snow in their pajamas. The fire department arrived and measured the CO levels. They were lethal. The furnace exhaust pipe had collapsed, venting the gas directly into the house. The firefighters told Robert that if they had slept for another hour, they would never have woken up. Robert credits his grandmother, but he also wonders if the grandmother was simply the form the angel took, a familiar face to ensure he would pay attention to the warning. Sometimes, the dream provides a medical diagnosis that doctors have missed. A woman named Elaine had been suffering from fatigue for months. Her doctors dismissed it as stress or early menopause. They ran basic blood work and told her to take vitamins. Elaine felt like she was slowly dying, but science told her she was fine. One night, she dreamt she was lying on an operating table. A surgeon in a white coat, whose face was obscured by a bright light, was standing over her. He was holding a scalpel. He pointed the scalpel at her thyroid gland, a small butterfly-shaped organ in the neck. He cut into it, and out crawled a black spider. The surgeon looked at Elaine and said, "It is hiding behind the left lobe. Tell them to look behind the left lobe." Elaine woke up terrified but energized. She made an appointment with a specialist and demanded an ultrasound, specifically asking them to look behind the left lobe of her thyroid. The doctor was skeptical, noting that her TSH levels were normal. Elaine refused to leave until he checked. Reluctantly, he performed the ultrasound. His face dropped. Hidden behind the left lobe, invisible to manual palpation, was a nodule. A biopsy confirmed it was papillary thyroid cancer. Because they caught it then, it was treatable. If she had waited another 6 months for symptoms to become visible, it would have spread to her lymph nodes. The dream surgeon had performed a biopsy in the spiritual realm before the physical doctors even knew where to look. These stories suggest that our consciousness is not limited to the waking hours. When the body rests, the spirit remains vigilant, connected to a network of information that transcends our 5 senses. Whether it is a warning about a plane, a furnace, or a tumor, the message is always the same. You are being watched over. You are valuable. Wake up. Volume 9. The Animal Messengers. Throughout human history, animals have been viewed as intermediaries between the earth and the sky. From the ravens of Odin to the dove of Noah, creatures of the wild are often seen as bearers of messages that humans are too distracted to hear. While science explains animal behavior through instinct and pheromones, there are countless documented cases where animals behave with a specific, intelligent intent that transcends survival instincts. These are the animal messengers, creatures that appear out of nowhere to guide the lost, protect the vulnerable, or deliver a final message of love from the other side. They suggest that the angelic realm does not always wear wings of feathers and light. Sometimes, it wears fur, paws, and the guise of a stray companion. In the autumn of 2003, a hiker named Ben was attempting a solo trek along a remote section of the Appalachian Trail in Tennessee. Ben was an experienced outdoorsman, but the weather in the mountains is capricious. A sudden, unforecasted fog rolled in, thick as milk, followed by a freezing rain. Ben became disoriented. He lost the trail markers. As night fell, the temperature dropped below freezing. Ben was soaking wet, shivering uncontrollably, and he knew he was in the early stages of hypothermia. He huddled under a rock overhang, convinced he would not survive the night. Just as he was closing his eyes, he heard a rustle in the brush. A dog emerged from the fog. It looked like a mix between a golden retriever and a husky, with thick, matted fur. It didn't bark. It walked right up to Ben and curled up against his chest. The heat radiating from the animal was immense. Ben wrapped his arms around the dog, burying his face in its fur. They slept that way for hours, the dog acting as a living furnace. At dawn, the dog stood up and nudged Ben. It walked a few yards away, stopped, and looked back. Ben followed. For 3 hours, the dog led him through dense, trail-less woods. Finally, they broke through the tree line onto a paved road, right next to a ranger station. Ben turned to pet the dog, to thank it, perhaps to adopt it. But the road behind him was empty. He asked the rangers about the dog. They looked at him strangely. "There are no stray dogs in this sector," the ranger said. "And if there were, the coyotes would have chased them off." Ben owes his life to a stray that appeared only when death was close, and vanished the moment safety was secured. Sometimes the animal is not a guide, but a barrier, a fierce protector that senses evil before it manifests. In 1998, a woman named Julie lived alone in a ground-floor apartment in Atlanta. She had a gentle, aging Labrador named Buster. Buster was the kind of dog who would lick a burglar to death. He had never growled at a human in his life. One evening, Julie came home late from work. She unlocked her front door, but as she tried to step inside, Buster did something he had never done. He blocked the doorway. He stood rigid, hackles raised, teeth bared, emitting a low, menacing growl that vibrated in his chest. Julie tried to push past him, thinking he was sick. Buster snapped at her, a warning nip at her hand, and physically pushed her back onto the porch. He refused to let her enter her own home. Confused and frightened by his behavior, Julie stayed on the porch and called her brother, who lived nearby. Her brother arrived 10 minutes later with a baseball bat. When they entered the house together, Buster finally stood down, but he ran immediately to the hallway closet and barked furiously. The brother opened the closet door. Hiding inside, clutching a knife, was a man who had broken in through the back window earlier that day. He had been waiting for Julie to come home. The police later confirmed the man was a serial offender. Buster, the gentle giant, had sensed the malevolence waiting in the dark and, possessed by a protective fury that defied his nature, ensured his mistress never walked into the trap. The most poignant animal messengers are those that appear in moments of grief, bridging the gap between the living and the dead. In 2011, a funeral was held for a young girl named Emily who had died of a rare heart condition. The service was held outdoors in a garden she loved. Her mother, Sarah, was inconsolable. She stood by the casket, weeping, feeling that her connection to her daughter was severed forever. As the minister began to speak, a brilliant red cardinal flew down from a nearby oak tree. Cardinals are skittish birds. They rarely allow humans to approach. But this bird flew directly to Sarah. It landed on her shoulder. The congregation gasped. Sarah froze. The bird didn't fly away. It hopped up closer, nuzzling against her cheek, chirping softly. It stayed there for the entire duration of the eulogy, nearly 20 minutes. Sarah felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of peace. She remembered that Emily had loved birds, and they had often watched cardinals together at the feeder. When the service ended, the bird took flight, circling the casket once before disappearing into the blue sky. To an ornithologist, it was aberrant behavior. To Sarah, it was a specific, deliberate sign that love is not bound by biology, and that the spirit can wear many wings to say goodbye. Volume 10. The Final Walk. We spend our lives fearing death, viewing it as a wall, a sudden end to the narrative. But those who work in hospice care, the nurses, the doctors, the chaplains, know a different truth. They see death not as a wall, but as a door. And they know that very few people walk through that door alone. The phenomenon of deathbed visions, DBVs, is so common that it is included in medical textbooks on palliative care. As the body shuts down, the veil lifts. Patients who have been unresponsive for days will suddenly wake up, lucid and joyful, staring at a corner of the room that appears empty to everyone else. They speak to parents who died decades ago. They reach out to hold unseen hands. These are the stories of the final walk, the angelic escorts who arrive to ensure that the journey home is not a lonely one. In a hospice facility in Arizona, a nurse named Maria was caring for an elderly patient named Walter. Walter was a grumpy man, a skeptic who had lived a hard life and had alienated most of his family. He was dying of liver failure and was terrified. He fought sleep, afraid he wouldn't wake up. He told Maria constantly that he didn't want to die because it's just dark. But 3 days before his death, Walter's demeanor changed. Maria walked into his room to check his vitals and found him sitting up, staring at the foot of his bed with a look of pure wonder. "Who are they?" Walter whispered. Maria looked. The room was empty. "Who, Walter?" she asked. Walter pointed a trembling finger. "The people in the white. There's a whole crowd of them. And, is that my brother?" Walter began to cry, but they were tears of relief. He started having a conversation with the empty air, laughing at jokes only he could hear. He turned to Maria. "They say they've come to walk me home. They say the light is warm." For the next 2 days, Walter was at peace. He slept soundly. When he finally passed, He did so with a smile on his face, his hand reaching out as if to grasp another. The terrified skeptic had been met by a welcoming committee that turned his fear into a homecoming. Sometimes, the transition is marked by a physical phenomenon that affects the environment, known as a shared death experience. In 2007, a woman named Linda was sitting by the bedside of her father in a hospital in London. It was 11:55 p.m. Her father had been in a coma for a week. The room was dim, lit only by the monitors. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the room changed. The air pressure dropped, popping Linda's ears. A strange, silvery light began to gather in the upper corner of the room, near the ceiling. It wasn't a reflection from the street, it was a self-contained luminescence. Linda watched, mesmerized, as the light expanded. She felt a sensation of immense love and expansion, as if the walls of the hospital had dissolved. At that exact moment, the heart monitor flatlined. The long, continuous beep signaled her father's death. But Linda didn't feel grief in that moment. She felt euphoria. She saw the silvery light swirl and then shoot upward, vanishing through the ceiling. Simultaneously, the battery-operated clock on the wall stopped dead at 11:55. Even more strangely, the wristwatch Linda was wearing stopped at the exact same second. She later found out that her brother, who was sleeping at home 5 miles away, had woken up at 11:55 p.m. with a sudden feeling that his father was standing in the room, smiling at him. The soul's departure had created a ripple in time and electricity, a shockwave of energy that registered on the clocks and hearts of those left behind. Perhaps the most compelling evidence of these escorts is the phenomenon of terminal lucidity. This occurs when patients with severe dementia or brain damage, people who haven't spoken or recognized family members in years, suddenly regain full mental clarity in the hours before death. In 1999, a woman named Catherine was dying of Alzheimer's. She had been nonverbal for 3 years, unable to recognize her own children, living in a fog of confusion. Her family had gathered around her bed to say goodbye to the shell of the woman they once knew. Suddenly, Catherine opened her eyes. They were clear, bright, and focused. She looked at her daughter and said, "Don't cry, honey. I'm almost there." The family was stunned. Catherine sat up, her movements fluid. She looked around the room and named every single person present. She told them she loved them. Then, she looked past them, toward the window. Her face lit up with a radiant, youthful joy. "Oh, look," she said, pointing at the empty window. "Look at the gardens. And look who's waiting. It's Mother. She's wearing her blue dress." Catherine laid her head back on the pillow, closed her eyes, and stopped breathing. The damage in her brain hadn't healed, but her consciousness had seemingly bypassed the broken biological machinery, stepping out of the fog to describe the view from the doorway of eternity. These stories of the final walk suggest that birth and death are symmetrical events. When we are born, we are greeted by loving hands that pull us into the light of this world. It seems that when we die, we are greeted by loving hands that pull us into the light of the next. We do not enter the darkness, we simply change the venue of the light. Volume 11, The Angel in the Fire. Fire is perhaps the most primal of all terrors. It consumes, it suffocates, and it disorients. In the midst of an inferno, the laws of the physical world seem to break down. Oxygen vanishes, structural integrity fails, and time accelerates. Yet, firefighters, the smoke eaters who willingly walk into these hellscapes, often report that they are not alone in the flames. There are stories of figures seen walking calmly through 2,000-degree heat, of invisible shields that deflect falling debris, and of mysterious alarms that wake sleeping families moments before the smoke detectors even sense a particle. These are the angels of the fire, the entities that walk unscathed through the furnace to guide the living out. In the winter of 1984, a massive apartment complex in Chicago caught fire in the dead of night. It was an old building with no sprinkler system and wooden stairwells that acted like chimneys. On the fourth floor, a young mother named Teresa was sleeping deeply, exhausted from a double shift. Her 2 children were in the room next door. The fire had started in the basement and raced up the walls, bypassing the alarms until the corridors were already filled with thick, toxic black smoke. By the time the alarms finally blared, the hallway was impassable. Teresa woke up coughing, the heat already blistering the paint on her walls. She grabbed her children and ran to the front door, but the handle was glowing red hot. They were trapped. Teresa retreated to the bedroom window, intending to scream for help, but she was 4 stories up. The smoke was thickening, filling the room from the floor up. She huddled with her children on the bed, pulling a blanket over their heads, preparing to die. Suddenly, the bedroom door, which she had locked, burst open. Standing in the frame, silhouetted against the raging orange fire of the hallway, was a tall figure. Teresa couldn't see a face, only a shape that looked like a man in a gray trench coat. He didn't look like a firefighter. He had no mask, no tank, no axe. He walked into the room, unaffected by the smoke that was choking Teresa. He didn't speak. He simply pointed to the closet. Teresa was confused. The closet was a dead end. But the figure marched over, grabbed Teresa by the arm with a grip that felt like cool iron, and pulled her and the children toward the closet. He kicked the back wall of the closet. To Teresa's shock, the plasterboard crumbled away effortlessly, revealing a narrow maintenance crawlspace that connected to the neighboring building, a passage she had no idea existed. The gray man shoved them through the hole into the cool, clear air of the next building's attic. Teresa turned back to help him through, but the closet was empty. The fire consumed her bedroom seconds later. When she told the fire marshal about the man and the crawlspace, he turned pale. "Ma'am," he said, "that crawlspace was sealed up in the 1920s. There's no way you could have known it was there. And there's no way a man without a respirator could have walked through that hallway. It was over 1,000 degrees. Sometimes, the intervention is internal, a sudden infusion of supernatural strength granted to those who rescue others." In 2001, a firefighter named Mike was battling a warehouse blaze in New Jersey. The roof collapsed, pinning a fellow firefighter, Steve, under a massive steel I-beam. The beam weighed roughly 3,000 pounds. Mike was alone with Steve. The rest of the crew had retreated due to the instability of the structure. Steve was screaming, his legs crushed, the fire closing in around them. Mike radioed for help, but the roof was unstable. No one could get to them in time. Mike knew he couldn't lift the beam. He was a strong man, but 3,000 pounds is a physical impossibility for a single human. He grabbed the beam in a desperate attempt to drag Steve out, screaming a prayer for help. Suddenly, Mike felt a surge of energy enter his back, right between his shoulder blades. He describes it as electricity without the pain. He felt his muscles lock, his vision tunnel, and he lifted. The steel beam rose 2 feet into the air. Steve dragged himself free. Mike held the beam for 10 seconds, allowing Steve to crawl to safety before dropping it. The crash shook the floor. They escaped moments before the floor collapsed. Later, doctors examined Mike. He had torn muscles in his back and shoulders, but his spine should have snapped. When asked how he did it, Mike simply said, "I didn't lift it. I was just the equipment. Something else provided the power." Volume 12, Military Miracles. There is an old saying that there are no atheists in foxholes. War is the ultimate chaotic environment, a place where luck, skill, and fate blend together in a terrifying mix. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen often develop a deep superstition, relying on charms and rituals to stay alive. But beyond superstition, the history of warfare is replete with accounts of inexplicable interventions: the phantom platoon that appears to hold a line and then vanishes, the voice that screams, "Get down!" seconds before a sniper fires, and the mysterious fog that rolls in to hide a retreating squad from enemy view. During the Korean War in 1951, a small American platoon was cut off from their unit during a night patrol. They were surrounded by enemy forces in a valley, pinned down by machine gun fire from the ridges above. The temperature was 20 degrees below zero. They were running low on ammunition, their radio was dead, and they had several wounded men. The lieutenant knew that when the sun rose, they would be overrun and wiped out. They needed to retreat, but they didn't know which way the enemy lines were thinnest. They huddled in a frozen ditch, waiting for the end. Around 3 a.m., a private named Johnson tapped the lieutenant on the shoulder. "Sir," he whispered, pointing into the darkness. "Who is that?" Standing on the ridgeline, fully exposed to enemy fire, was a figure dressed in white. It wasn't winter camouflage, it was a glowing, luminous white. The figure raised an arm and motioned for them to follow. "It's a trap," the lieutenant hissed. But as they watched, the enemy bullets seemed to pass right through the figure. The figure turned and began walking slowly along a narrow goat path leading up the eastern ridge. Desperate, and feeling a strange sense of calm emanating from the figure, the lieutenant ordered his men to follow. They carried their wounded, struggling up the icy slope. The figure stayed 50 yards ahead of them, visible only to the platoon. It led them through a minefield, literally walking over ground that should have exploded, and through a gap in the enemy lines that was unguarded. As they crested the ridge and saw the lights of the American camp in the distance, the sun began to break. The figure stopped, looked back at them once, and dissolved into the morning mist. The platoon made it back without firing a single shot. When they told their story, intelligence officers confirmed that the path they took was the only route not covered by enemy artillery. They had been guided by a scout who left no footprints in the snow. In more recent conflicts, the interventions often take the form of impossible intuition. In 2006, a Marine sergeant named David was leading a convoy in Iraq. He was the driver of the lead Humvee. They were traveling down a road they had swept a dozen times before. It was a routine supply run. Suddenly, David felt a physical hand slap him on the chest. It was a hard, forceful strike that knocked the wind out of him. He slammed on the brakes, screeching the convoy to a halt in the middle of the open road. "Sergeant, what are you doing?" the gunner yelled. "We're sitting ducks." David didn't know why he had stopped. He just gasped, clutching his chest, feeling the phantom pain of the slap. "Back up," he ordered. "Everyone back up. Now." The convoy reversed 50 yards. David stared at the patch of dirt where he would have driven. It looked perfectly normal. He called in the EOD, Explosive Ordnance Disposal, team. They sent out a robot. Buried directly under the road, wired to a pressure plate that David was milliseconds from hitting, was a massive IED consisting of 3 artillery shells. The blast would have vaporized the lead vehicle and killed everyone inside. When David took off his flak jacket later that night, there was a red handprint on his chest, right over his heart, a bruise from a blow that saved his life. Volume 13, Angels at Sea. The ocean is the closest thing to outer space on Earth. It is vast, dark, silent, and indifferent to human life. When a sailor falls overboard, or a ship loses power in a storm, the isolation is absolute. There are no neighbors to hear you scream. Yet, the lore of the sea is filled with stories of the third man, a presence that appears in life rafts to guide survivors, or the mysterious lights that lead drowning men to the surface. These are the angels of the deep, operating in a domain where humans are intruders. In 1996, a solo sailor named Tony was competing in a race across the Atlantic. He was 1,000 miles from the coast of Africa when a rogue wave capsized his sailboat in the middle of the night. Tony was thrown into the water. He wasn't wearing a life jacket. The boat righted itself, but it was moving away from him in the high winds. Tony was a strong swimmer, but he was wearing heavy foul-weather gear that dragged him down. He fought for 10 minutes, but the waves were 20 feet high. He swallowed water. He felt his legs cramping. He realized, with a terrifying clarity, that he was going to drown alone in the pitch black. He stopped fighting. He let himself sink. He went under, looking up at the churning foam on the surface. Suddenly, he felt a shove. It wasn't a drift of current, it was a focused, solid push from beneath his feet. It felt like someone was standing below him in the abyss, pushing him upward. He broke the surface, gasping. He treaded water, confused. He sank again, exhausted. Again the push came, firm, rhythmic, boosting him up. Then, he heard a voice. It wasn't in his head. It was distinct, shouting over the roar of the wind. "Swim to the light." Tony looked around. There was no moon. But about 100 yards away, he saw a faint, green phosphorescent glow bobbing in the water. He assumed it was a chemical light stick from his boat. He swam toward it, the invisible force pushing him from below every time he faltered. He reached the light. It wasn't a stick. It was a patch of glowing algae clinging to the side of his boat, which had turned into the wind and stalled. Tony grabbed the railing and hauled himself aboard. He collapsed on the deck, alive. He looked back at the water. The push vanished. The voice was silent. Tony completed the race, but he never sailed solo again. He knew that the ocean was too big for one man, unless that man had help from below. There are also stories of lighthouses that shine when the bulbs are burnt out. In the 1890s, off the coast of Scotland, a supply ship was trying to reach a remote lighthouse during a ferocious gale. The keeper had been reported sick, and the light had been dark for 2 nights. As the ship approached the treacherous rocks, the captain realized he couldn't see the coastline. He was flying blind, moments from crashing into the reefs. The crew prepared for impact. Suddenly, the lighthouse beam cut through the storm. It was brilliant, steady, and rotating perfectly. Using the light as a reference, the captain navigated the ship into the safe harbor. The crew cheered. They docked and ran up to the lighthouse to thank the keeper for fixing the lamp just in time. When they broke down the door, they found the keeper dead in his bed. He had been dead for at least 24 hours. They climbed the tower to the lantern room. The oil lamp was dry. The wick was cold and charred. The mechanism was rusted shut. There was no physical way the light could have been operating. Yet, an entire ship's crew had navigated by it for an hour. The logbook of the ship remains in the Maritime Museum, testifying to the night the lighthouse was manned by the keeper's ghost. These stories from the fire, the battlefield, and the sea remind us that extreme danger seems to act as a beacon for spiritual intervention. It is as if the extremity of the human condition rings a bell in the ether, summoning aid that defies the laws of nature to preserve the spark of life. Volume 14. The Unseen Hand of Justice. Human malice is a terrifying force. When we encounter violence, a mugging in a dark alley, a home invasion, or a random act of aggression, we often feel a distinct sense of spiritual darkness. In these moments, the intervention of the angelic realm takes on a fiercer quality. These are not the gentle comforters of the hospice ward. These are the shield bearers, the entities that stand between the innocent and the predator. Police officers and victims alike have reported inexplicable phenomena that prevented crimes. Weapons that jammed for no mechanical reason, invisible barriers that attackers could not cross, and phantom sirens that scared away criminals minutes before the real police arrived. In the autumn of 2009, a university student named Maya was jogging through a park in Philadelphia. It was dusk, and she had stayed out later than she intended. The path was lined with thick shrubbery. As she turned a corner near the river, a man stepped out from the bushes. He was wearing a ski mask and holding a serrated knife. He grabbed Maya's arm, dragging her off the path toward the darkness of the tree line. Maya screamed, but the park was empty. She fought back, but he was stronger. She felt the cold point of the knife against her ribs. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl vibrated through the air. It sounded like a massive, angry Rottweiler or a wolf. It was so loud that Maya felt the sound waves hit her chest. The attacker froze, his eyes widening behind the mask. He looked to his left, where the sound came from. Maya looked too. Standing in the shadows was a silhouette of a dog, but it was huge, its shoulders nearly waist-high to a man. Its eyes glowed with a faint, unnatural luminescence. The beast let out a bark that sounded like a gunshot. Terrified, the attacker shoved Maya away and sprinted in the opposite direction, dropping his knife in the grass. Maya fell to her knees, sobbing. She waited for the dog to approach her, to check if it was friendly. But the silhouette simply dissolved into the mist coming off the river. When the police arrived, they found the knife and footprints of the attacker, but there were no paw prints in the soft mud where the dog had stood. Maya was saved by a hound of heaven. Sometimes, the intervention is less about intimidation and more about impossible physics hindering a weapon. In 1994, a convenience store clerk named Gary was working the night shift in Detroit. A man walked in, jittery and high on narcotics, and pulled a revolver. He demanded the cash from the register. Gary complied, handing over the money. But the robber wasn't satisfied. He decided he didn't want a witness. He raised the gun, aimed it at Gary's chest from 3 feet away, and pulled the trigger. Gary flinched, waiting for the bullet. He heard the hammer click. The gun didn't fire. The robber, frustrated, racked the slide, thinking it was a semi-automatic, or recocked the revolver and fired again. Click. He tried a third time. Click. Panic set in on the robber's face. He cursed, threw the gun at Gary, and ran out the door. Gary stood there, unharmed. The police recovered the gun. When the ballistics expert examined it, he found the cylinder fully loaded with live ammunition. He test-fired the gun at the range. It fired perfectly every single time. There was no jammed pin, no faulty spring. The primer on the bullets the robber had tried to fire showed deep indentations. The hammer had struck them with full force. Yet, the gunpowder had refused to ignite 3 times in a row. The odds of 3 consecutive misfires of functional ammo are astronomical. It was as if a finger had been placed over the barrel, holding the explosion inside. There are also stories of the phantom officer. In 2015, a woman named Chloe was driving alone on a highway in New Mexico when she noticed a truck tailgating her aggressively. The driver was flashing his lights and swerving. Chloe tried to change lanes, but the truck followed. It was a road rage incident escalating quickly. The truck rammed her bumper, sending her car spinning into the median. Chloe sat in her stalled car, terrified, as the truck driver, a large, angry man, got out of his vehicle with a tire iron and marched toward her window. Chloe locked her doors and fumbled for her phone, but she knew she didn't have time. The man raised the tire iron to smash her windshield. Suddenly, a police cruiser's siren blared directly behind them. Blue and red lights flooded the scene. A tall police officer in a tan uniform stepped out, hand on his holster, and shouted, "Drop the weapon! Get on the ground!" The attacker immediately dropped the tire iron and raised his hands, terrified. Chloe put her head down on the steering wheel, sobbing with relief. She heard the officer reading the man his rights. She waited for the officer to knock on her window. After 2 minutes of silence, she looked up. The road was empty. The attacker's truck was gone. The police cruiser was gone. There was no officer. Confused, she called 911. The state troopers arrived 10 minutes later. Chloe explained that a tan-uniformed officer had already intervened. The troopers looked at each other. "Ma'am," one said, "state troopers wear black and gray. Sheriff deputies wear green. No one in this state wears tan uniforms." Chloe later described the uniform in detail to a historian. It perfectly matched the uniform of the New Mexico State Police from the 1950s. A ghostly patrolman was still walking his beat, protecting travelers on the lonely desert highway. Volume 15, Angels in the Wild. When humans step into the wilderness, they enter a world that is indifferent to their survival. The mountains, the deserts, and the deep forests operate on ancient, brutal rules. There is no cell service, no ambulance, and no safety net. It is in this profound isolation, when the body is broken and the elements are closing in, that the third man factor often occurs. This phenomenon, named by explorers, refers to the sensation of an unseen presence that accompanies survivalists in extreme duress, a presence that offers guidance, warmth, and the will to keep moving when biology says to quit. One of the most famous modern accounts comes from a climber named Joe, who was scaling a peak in the Andes in 1985. A storm hit during his descent, and Joe fell into a crevasse, breaking his leg and shattering his knee. He was trapped in an ice tomb, unable to climb out. His climbing partner, believing Joe was dead, had cut the rope to save himself. Joe was left for dead at 19,000 feet. He was dehydrated, freezing, and in agony. He should have died within hours. Instead, Joe began to hear a voice. It wasn't his internal monologue, it was a distinct, external voice that was stern and commanding. "Do not sleep," the voice said. "Dig." Joe obeyed. For 3 days, he crawled through the glacier, dragging his broken leg. The voice navigated him. "Left here. Watch the ice bridge. Keep moving." At night, when the temperature dropped to 40 below, Joe felt a phantom body lying next to him, radiating heat that kept his blood from freezing. He hallucinated that he was walking with a companion who was constantly checking his ropes. This companion guided him down the mountain, through a labyrinth of crevasses, to the very edge of the base camp where his friends were packing up to leave. When Joe crawled into camp, looking like a ghost, the voice finally spoke one last word: "Rest." Joe survived injuries that medical experts said were unsurvivable, guided by a Sherpa of the spirit. Sometimes, the wilderness angel provides sustenance. In the summer of 1999, a 7-year-old boy named Cody wandered away from a campground in the Oregon wilderness. A massive search and rescue operation was launched. Hundreds of volunteers combed the woods. For 4 days, Cody was missing. The nights were cold, and the terrain was rugged. Hope was fading. On the 5th day, a helicopter spotted him sitting on a rock, miles from the camp. When the rescuers reached him, they expected to find a dehydrated, traumatized child. Instead, Cody was clean, hydrated, and calm. He wasn't hungry. When asked how he survived, Cody told a story that gave the rescuers chills. He said a green lady had found him on the first night. "She glowed like a firefly," Cody said. "She brought me berries that tasted like bread. And at night, she wrapped her wings around me, and they were warm like a blanket." The rescuers checked his stomach contents at the hospital. He was full of a nutrient-rich paste that the doctors couldn't identify. It wasn't any berry known to grow in Oregon. Cody also had no bug bites, despite the woods being infested with mosquitoes. Something had fed him and shielded him from the insects and the cold. The wilderness also holds stories of the impossible trail. In 2014, a hiker named Sarah was trekking in the Grand Canyon. She took a wrong turn and ended up in a slot canyon, a dead-end maze of red rock. She ran out of water. The heat was 110 degrees. Heat stroke set in. She collapsed, her vision blurring, her tongue swelling. She prepared to die. As she lay on the hot sand, she saw a man walking toward her. He looked like a Native American, dressed in traditional buckskin, carrying a gourd. He knelt beside her and poured water into her mouth. It was the coldest, sweetest water she had ever tasted. He pulled her to her feet. "Walk in my shadow," he said. He began to walk. Sarah followed him. He led her through a crack in the canyon wall that she swore hadn't been there before, a hidden passage that led upward, winding through the cliffs. The climb should have been exhausting, but Sarah felt weightless. Within an hour, they reached the rim of the canyon, right next to a tourist parking lot. Sarah turned to thank the guide, but he was gone. She looked back at the trail they had come up. It was a sheer cliff face. There was no path. No human could have climbed it without ropes. Yet, her boots were dusty with the red clay of the canyon floor. She had been led out via a spirit path, guided by a guardian of the land who knew the secret ways of the stone. These stories suggest that the wilderness is not empty. It is populated by presences that respect the sanctity of life, entities that act as rangers for the lost, ensuring that a simple mistake in navigation does not become a death sentence. Volume 16, The Silent Partners, Angels in the Workplace. We spend the majority of our waking lives at work. Whether in the gleaming corridors of a high-rise, the grit of a factory floor, or the chaotic noise of a construction site, the workplace is a theater of routine. But routine can breed complacency, and complacency invites danger. In these environments of heavy machinery, high voltage, and high stress, the difference between a normal Tuesday and a tragedy is often measured in millimeters. The stories of workplace angels suggest that the divine does not clock out. These are the silent partners, the invisible supervisors who intervene when the safety protocols fail, stopping the gears, catching the falling hammer, or whispering a warning that saves an entire shift from disaster. Consider the harrowing account of a steelworker named Jack, who helped build the skylines of Chicago in the late 1990s. Jack was an ironworker, a man who walked the narrow steel I-beams 50 stories above the pavement, often with nothing but the wind between him and a fatal drop. He was experienced and fearless, trusting his boots and his balance. One windy October afternoon, Jack was maneuvering a heavy steel plate into position. A sudden violent gust of wind, a microburst, hit the building. The plate swung on the crane cable, knocking Jack off balance. He slipped. His safety harness wasn't clipped in because he was moving between secure points. He fell backward into the open air. He remembers looking up at the gray sky, his stomach dropping, knowing he was dead. He didn't scream, he just closed his eyes. Then, he stopped. He didn't hit the ground, he stopped in mid-air, roughly 3 feet below the beam. He felt a hand, a massive, rough hand, grab the back of his tool belt. It wasn't the jerk of a lanyard, it was a grip. The hand hauled him upward against gravity, effortlessly lifting his 200-pound frame back onto the I-beam. Jack scrambled to his knees, hugging the steel, shaking uncontrollably. He looked around to thank his partner, Mike. But Mike was 40 feet away, operating the crane, looking at Jack with a face white as a sheet. Mike later said, "I saw you go over, Jack. I saw you fall. And then, it looked like a movie played in reverse. You just flew back up. There was no one else on the beam." Jack checked his belt. The leather loop was stretched, bearing the imprint of 4 large fingers, a physical testament to the grip that defied gravity. Sometimes, the intervention happens in the deafening roar of a factory. In 1982, a woman named Dolores was working the line at an automotive stamping plant in Detroit. Her job was to feed sheets of metal into a massive hydraulic press. It was monotonous, rhythmic work. Slide, press, remove. One afternoon, a sheet of metal got stuck. Without thinking, a moment of autopilot error, Dolores reached her hand into the machine to dislodge it. Her foot was still hovering near the pedal that activated the multi-ton press. As her hand entered the crush zone, the factory floor, usually a cacophony of grinding metal and sirens, went silent for her. In her right ear, a voice screamed, "Pull back!" It was so loud it hurt. Dolores yanked her hand back instinctively, clutching it to her chest. A split second later, the press slammed down on its own. A hydraulic malfunction had caused it to cycle without the foot pedal. If her hand had been there, it would have been flattened instantly. Dolores looked around. The worker next to her was wearing ear protection and humming, completely unaware. The voice hadn't come from the foreman. It had come from the air itself, timing its command to the millisecond of the machine's failure. There are also stories of the impossible temp, a mysterious worker who shows up to save a business from ruin and then vanishes. In 2008, a small bakery owner named Maria was on the verge of bankruptcy. It was the night before a massive holiday order, the order that would save her business. But her oven broke, and her 2 assistants called in sick with the flu. Maria was alone, crying in the kitchen at midnight, facing financial ruin. She prayed for help, not knowing what else to do. The back door bell rang. Standing there was a young man she had never seen. He wore a pristine white baker's uniform. "I'm the agency temp," he said. "I heard you needed a hand." Maria hadn't called an agency, but she was too desperate to argue. She let him in. The man was a virtuoso. He fixed the oven with a simple twist of a valve she didn't know existed. He kneaded dough with a speed and precision she had never seen. They worked in silence for 6 hours, producing double the inventory Maria had planned. The pastries were perfect, better than Maria's own recipes. As the sun came up, the delivery truck arrived. Maria turned to the sink to wash her hands and get the man his check. "What is your hourly rate?" she asked. When she turned back, the kitchen was empty. The back door was locked from the inside. There was no paperwork, no agency invoice. Just tray after tray of golden bread, and a business that remains open to this day. Volume 17, Historical Miracles, Echoes of the Past. The phenomenon of angelic intervention is not a modern curiosity. It is a thread that runs through the tapestry of human history. When we look back at the journals of explorers, the letters of soldiers from the great wars, and the oral traditions of pioneers, we find the same stories we hear today. The clothing changes, the technology evolves, but the angels remain the same. These historical miracles remind us that the unseen world has always walked beside us, guiding humanity through its darkest winters and its bloodiest battlefields. One of the most enduring legends comes from the frozen wasteland of Antarctica during the heroic age of exploration. In 1916, Sir Ernest Shackleton and 2 companions were attempting a desperate trek across South Georgia Island to save their stranded crew. They were starving, dehydrated, and walking over uncharted glaciers with improvised gear. Failure meant death for 28 men. Years later, in his memoirs, Shackleton wrote a strange confession. He admitted that during the 36-hour march, he often felt that there were 4 people walking, not 3. His companions, Worsley and Crean, independently confessed the same thing. They each experienced the distinct sensation of a 4th presence, walking alongside them, a silent figure who offered no words but radiated a sense of direction and strength. When they stumbled, they felt a steadying hand. When they were about to give up in the snow, they felt a compulsion to take just one more step. This phenomenon, now known as the third man factor, referencing T.S. Eliot's poem inspired by the event, suggests that when human endurance reaches its absolute limit, a spiritual reserve is unlocked. The fourth man guided them through a hurricane and over mountains that modern climbers with GPS struggle to navigate, ensuring the survival of the entire expedition. We also find these echoes in the bloody trenches of World War I. The Angel of Mons is a famous legend, but less well known is the story of the Nurse of the Somme. In 1916, a British private named Arthur was wounded in no man's land. His leg was shattered by shrapnel. He lay in a shell crater for 2 days, bleeding, hidden by mud, unable to crawl back to his lines. The battle raged around him. He was dying of thirst and infection. On the second night, the shelling stopped briefly. Arthur looked up to see a woman in a nurse's uniform walking across the mud. It was impossible. No civilian women were allowed near the front, let alone in the kill zone of no man's land. She carried a lantern that cast a soft, localized light, invisible to the enemy machine gunners. She knelt beside him. She gave him water from a canteen that never seemed to run dry. She changed his bandages with clean white linen she pulled from a small satchel. "Stay quiet, Arthur," she whispered. "The stretcher-bearers are coming." She sat with him through the night, shielding him with her body when the mortars fell close. At dawn, a British recovery team found him. They were shocked he was alive. Arthur asked about the nurse. The medics looked at him with pity. "Son," they said, "there hasn't been a woman within 50 miles of here." But Arthur's leg was bound in clean, white linen, fabric that wasn't army issue, stitched with a care that didn't exist in the trenches. Going further back to the American frontier, we find the story of the rider in the blizzard. In the winter of 1888, a schoolhouse in the Dakota Territory was caught in the children's blizzard, a sudden, ferocious storm that dropped the temperature to 40 below zero in minutes. The teacher, a young woman named Minnie, realized the roof of the sod schoolhouse was collapsing under the snow. She had to get the children to the nearest farmhouse, a mile away. They tied themselves together with a long rope and stepped into the whiteout. They immediately lost their way. The wind blinded them. They were freezing to death, wandering in circles. Minnie was about to tell the children to dig into a snowbank and pray, when a rider on a dark horse appeared out of the swirling white. He didn't speak. He simply walked his horse in front of them, breaking the wind, creating a path in the deep drifts. He led them steadily southeast. Whenever a child fell, the rider would stop and wait, his horse standing like a statue until the child was up. He led them directly to the door of the farmhouse. When the farmer opened the door to pull the frozen children inside, Minnie turned to thank the rider. He and the horse dissolved into the snow, leaving no hoof prints. The children survived because they followed a ghost of the plains. Volume 18, The Impossible Catch, Angels in Athletics. The human body is a machine capable of incredible feats, but it also has hard limits. Bones snap under specific torque, muscles tear under specific loads. In the world of sports and extreme athletics, athletes push themselves to the very edge of these limits. It is here, in the split second between a gold medal and a catastrophic injury, that the guardian of the arena often appears. These are not stories of cheating or performance enhancement, they are stories of protection. They are accounts of weights becoming weightless, of mid-air trajectories shifting to prevent paralysis, and of mysterious spotters who step out of the shadows when an athlete is alone and in mortal danger. In the winter of 2008, a competitive powerlifter named Marcus was training late at night in a gym in Ohio. It was 2 a.m., and the facility was deserted. Marcus was preparing for a national competition and decided to push his limits on the bench press. He loaded the bar with 405 pounds, a weight he had lifted before, but never this late or this tired. He lay back on the bench, uninvited danger into his routine by not asking for a spotter, assuming the gym was empty anyway. He unracked the weight. As he lowered it to his chest, his right tricep tore. The muscle failure was instant and agonizing. The heavy bar dropped like a guillotine, plummeting toward his throat. Marcus tried to catch it, but with one arm useless, he was helpless. He braced for the impact that would crush his windpipe. He squeezed his eyes shut and screamed. But the bar never hit him. It stopped 2 inches from his neck. Marcus felt the bar hovering, trembling slightly. He opened his eyes. Standing behind the bench, looking down at him, was a man. He was massive, wearing an old-style gray sweatsuit with the hood up, obscuring his face. The man wasn't straining. He was holding 405 pounds with his fingertips, as if it were a PVC pipe. He calmly lifted the bar back up and racked it safely onto the hooks. Marcus, gasping for air and clutching his torn arm, rolled off the bench to thank him. "I didn't hear you come in," Marcus panted. "I thought I was dead." He turned to shake the man's hand. The gym was empty. The doors were locked from the inside. The motion sensor lights in the lobby hadn't triggered. Marcus was alone in a locked building with a racked bar and a saved life. He later found a plaque in the lobby dedicated to a former owner of the gym, a powerlifter who had died in the 1980s, a man known for wearing a gray hooded sweatsuit while he trained. Sometimes, the intervention occurs in the high-speed chaos of contact sports. In 1999, a high school quarterback named Jason was playing in the state championship game in Texas. It was the 4th quarter. Jason dropped back to pass but was blindsided by a linebacker who weighed 240 pounds. The hit was awkward. Jason's cleats stuck in the turf while his upper body was twisted violently backward. As he fell, he saw the ground coming up, and he realized his neck was bent at an angle that snapped spines. He felt the terrifying crunch of vertebrae grinding. "I'm paralyzed," he thought. "This is it." But as his helmet hit the turf, he felt a cushion. It wasn't the grass. It felt like a thick, warm layer of gel had instantly materialized between his head and the ground. He bounced. The impact, which should have driven his neck into his shoulders, was absorbed completely. He lay there for a moment, waiting for the numbness. Instead, he felt a hand pat him on the helmet. A voice, clear as a bell amidst the roar of the crowd, whispered, "Get up. You're whole." Jason stood up. He shook his limbs. No pain. No tingling. The team doctor watched the replay on the sidelines later. He turned pale. "Jason," the doctor said, "mechanically speaking, your C2 vertebrae should have shattered. I watched your head hit. I don't know how you're walking." Jason knew. He had been caught by a player who wasn't on the roster. Then there is the phenomenon of the spirit pacer. In 2013, a woman named Emily was running her first ultramarathon in the deserts of Utah. At mile 80, dehydration and heat exhaustion set in. She was alone on the trail, miles from an aid station. Her vision blurred. Her legs gave out. She collapsed into the dust, ready to quit, ready to wait for the sweep vehicle to pick her up in failure. As she lay there, a runner jogged past her. He was an older man, wearing a white singlet and vintage running shoes. He stopped and jogged in place. "Come on, Emily," he said, knowing her name though her bib didn't have it printed on the front. "The pain is just information. Run with me." He reached out a hand. When Emily took it, she felt a jolt of energy, like caffeine and adrenaline mixed together. shoot up her arm. She stood up. The man started running. Emily followed. For the next 20 miles, every time she flagged, the man would look back and smile, and she would feel that surge of energy again. They crossed the finish line together in the dark. Emily turned to hug him, to introduce him to her family. He wasn't there. She checked the race results. No one in her age group or the men's group matched his description. No runner had crossed the line at the same time as her. She had been paced by a ghost runner who refused to let her fail. Volume 19, The Ghost in the Machine, Tech Miracles. We live in a binary world of ones and zeros. We believe that technology is cold, logical, and immune to the spiritual. A computer does what it is programmed to do. A GPS follows satellites. A phone connects towers. But as our lives migrate into the digital realm, so too do the interventions. The tech miracles are a modern phenomenon, stories where the code breaks in a specific, benevolent way. A text message from a dead number, a GPS that glitches to avoid a collapsing bridge, or a voicemail that reappears years after being deleted to deliver a crucial warning. These stories suggest that the divine can inhabit the circuit board just as easily as the cloud. The story of the glitch that saved a life comes from a software engineer named David in Silicon Valley. In 2014, David was driving to a high-stakes meeting in San Francisco. He relied entirely on his GPS navigation app to beat the notorious Bay Area traffic. He was on the highway, approaching a specific exit that he took every day. The GPS showed the route as clear, green, and fast. Suddenly, the screen glitched. The map scrambled, pixelating violently. Then, the voice of the GPS, usually the standard robotic female voice, changed. It became deeper, distorted, and urgent. "Exit now," it commanded. "Take next exit." The screen rerouted him off the highway, adding 40 minutes to his trip. David was furious. He tried to override it, but the app froze on the new route. Cursing his phone, he took the exit, assuming the software was bugged. He sat in Surface Street traffic, fuming, missing the start of his meeting. 10 minutes later, his radio interrupted the music with a breaking news alert. A massive pileup had just occurred on the highway he had exited. A tanker truck carrying flammable liquid had jackknifed and exploded, incinerating 4 cars and collapsing a section of the overpass. The accident happened at the exact mile marker where David would have been had he not taken the exit. The time of impact matched his ETA perfectly. When David looked at his phone, the GPS app had reset. It was working perfectly again. He checked the voice settings. There was no deep male voice option available. The algorithm hadn't saved him. A ghost in the machine had hacked the code to steer him away from the fire. Sometimes, the message comes via text, defying the logic of telecommunications. In 2010, a teenage girl named Chloe was at a house party in a rough neighborhood. She was uncomfortable but didn't want to leave her friends. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text message from her grandmother's number. The message read, "Go home. Danger." Chloe stared at the screen. Her grandmother had passed away 3 months earlier. Her phone had been disconnected. The number was out of service. Chloe assumed it was a cruel prank or a system error, but the fear it instilled was real. She grabbed her purse and told her friends she was leaving. They mocked her, but she insisted. She walked out the door and caught a cab. 20 minutes after she left, a drive-by shooting occurred at the house. 2 people were injured in the living room where Chloe had been sitting. The next day, Chloe went to the phone store with her parents. They showed the text to the manager. He pulled up the logs. "This is impossible," the manager said. "The sender's number is deactivated. It doesn't exist on the network anymore. And look at the timestamp." The text had been received at 11:45 p.m. But according to the network logs, no data had hit Chloe's phone at that time. The message existed on her screen, but it had never traveled through a cell tower. It was a digital phantom, a warning sent from a server that wasn't on Earth. There is also the phenomenon of the impossible photo. In 2016, a woman named Sarah was hiking alone in the Rockies. She set up her phone on a timer to take a picture of herself on a scenic ridge. She was lonely. She had recently gone through a divorce and was feeling a deep sense of abandonment. She prayed for a sign that she wasn't alone in the world. She smiled, the timer clicked, and she hiked back down. When she got back to her hotel and reviewed the photos, she gasped. In the photo, standing directly behind her on the narrow ridge, was a figure. It was a translucent, shimmering shape of a human, with a hand resting gently on her shoulder. Sarah knew for a fact she was alone. The ridge was a dead end with a 1,000-foot drop on 3 sides. She took the photo to an image expert, expecting him to say it was a lens flare or a double exposure. The expert analyzed the pixels. "This isn't a glitch," he said. "The light is interacting with the object. See here. The figure is casting a shadow on your jacket. Whatever this is, it had mass. It was physically there." Sarah kept the photo as her screensaver, a permanent, digital reminder that even at the top of the world, in the depths of loneliness, she was being held. These technological interventions remind us that miracles are not limited to ancient times or natural settings. As humanity builds new tools, the guardians adapt. They use our screens, our speakers, and our networks to deliver the oldest message of all: you are safe. Volume 20. The Unfinished Business, Angels of Resolution. Death often leaves loose ends. Words left unsaid, secrets kept, and items lost can torment the living for decades. But sometimes, the angelic intervention is not about saving a life, but about settling a soul. These are the angels of resolution, entities that intervene to ensure that the truth comes out, that the will is found, or that the final "I love you" is delivered, allowing both the living and the dead to find peace. In 1999, a woman named Karen was cleaning out the attic of her late father's house. Her father had died suddenly, and the family was tearing itself apart looking for his life insurance policy. Without it, her mother would lose the house. They had searched every file cabinet, every safe, every box. It was gone. The family was arguing downstairs, the stress reaching a breaking point. Karen sat on the floor of the dusty attic, weeping. "Daddy," she whispered, "please help us. We're losing everything." A draft swept through the sealed attic. A single sheet of paper fluttered down from the rafters above Karen's head. She looked up. There was no open window, no vent. The paper landed in her lap. It was an old, yellowed envelope. Inside was not the policy, but a receipt for a safe deposit box at a bank across town, a box no one knew existed. The key was taped to the back of the receipt. Karen rushed to the bank. Inside the box was the policy, along with a letter to her mother. The draft that dislodged the paper had ignored the laws of aerodynamics to drop the solution right into her hands. Sometimes, the resolution involves a lost object that carries immense sentimental value. In 2005, a man named Tom lost his wedding ring while gardening. It was his grandfather's ring, a family heirloom. He spent weeks with a metal detector, tearing up his lawn. He gave up, heartbroken. 5 years later, Tom was sitting on his porch, thinking about his grandfather on the anniversary of his death. He watched a blue jay land in the grass. The bird pecked at the ground, then flew up to the porch railing. It dropped something from its beak with a metallic clink and flew away. Tom looked at the floorboards. There, shining in the sun, was the ring. It was clean. It had no dirt on it. If it had been buried in the yard for 5 years, it should have been impacted with mud. Instead, it looked polished. The bird had not only found a ring buried inches deep in soil, it had cleaned it and delivered it to the feet of the owner on the specific anniversary of the ancestor's death. Tom put the ring back on, understanding that the delivery was a message. Nothing is truly lost.